So I'm going to say a word that is only going to bring back memories for people that are in my kind of age demographic. So I apologize as I start for those that are older than me or younger than me, but I feel like this is a great illustration to start off my sermon right, and that is the word Napster. And so if you were not a young adult in the early 2000s, you probably have no idea what the word Napster is. But Napster was one of the first sites on the internet where you could download music. Eventually, you could download TV shows and movies as well for free, illegally. It was actually a piracy site. It was a site where you could basically steal music and not pay for it. And this site spread like wildfire. Like within a matter of months, it seemed like everybody in my age group was using it. You know, it was great way to get music without having to pay for it, right? So for a poor college student or young adult, it was a way to get the music they wanted without spending their non-existent money on it. And so I was one of the folks that did not participate in it. You know, I thought it was wrong. It was legally and ethically stealing music. It was getting music without paying for it. Now, of course, I'm not sharing this in order to toot my own horn this morning. Look how righteous I was back then. But I share this because most of my friends thought it was so weird that I did not participate in this. Like, everybody does it. Why don't you join in? And this was from folks that went to a Christian college where they should have that moral framework that stealing was wrong. But for many people, including those that were followers of Jesus, you know, right and wrong, especially with what you can and cannot steal, had been redefined along the lines of a popular opinion. And so this is a great example of what Jesus and the writers of the New Testament call the world, which is the third and final enemy of the soul. Again, the world. So if you have a Bible, feel free to turn to John chapter 17, verses 14 through 23. John chapter 17, verses 14 through 23. And this is our passage for this morning. And of course, you can find this passage in your sermon notes, which are listed in your bulletin, as well as I'll have it on the screen for us in just a matter of moments. But as you turn there, I'd just like to take a second to define what this word world means. The word world comes from the Greek word cosmos, which we've heard of that word before. And biblically, this word has a few different meanings to it. Sometimes in the Bible, it's talking about the actual literal the earth. Sometimes it's talking about the people that are in the world. But in our context today, and most times, it's talking about the patterns of the world. And actually, in week 1 of the series, here's how we defined the world. The sinful patterns of thinking, living, and believing that become normalized in a society. The sinful patterns of thinking, living, and believing that become normalized in a society. It's a system or pattern of being that is opposed to the ways or things of God. And according to Romans chapter 12, verse 2, the world, the culture has a conforming effect on us. Paul wrote, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. It's this idea that as followers of Jesus, that we need to recognize that the world wants to fit us in its mold to get us to believe and think and live in a certain way. And as followers of Jesus, our call is to see that and to resist that by the power of the Spirit and to follow the way of Jesus. To be transformed by Him and not be conformed by this world. You know, according to the New Testament, there's a way of the world that functions kind of like a water current that goes beneath the surface, that we often don't see it. It's the waters that we're swimming in the world around us, and if we don't recognize the current for what it is, then we can easily get swept away by it and be taken somewhere that we don't want to go. Actually, this current conforms you to its image and takes you where it wants you to go. That certain beliefs and thoughts and practices become normalized to the point where it's hard to see things being otherwise in your life. And so my goal today is to help us to start to ask questions in our own lives on how the world is shaping us, and to become even more aware the power of the world has to conform us even without us knowing it. So we're going to dig into John chapter 17, and this is Jesus praying to God the Father about his disciples before his death, resurrection, and ascension. That he's trying to prepare them for his departure. And I'm going to read just a few verses at a time. I'll stop, give some commentary, and then we'll continue on with the passage. So first, I'm just going to read verses 14 and 15. This is Jesus, of course. He says, I have given them your word, and the world has hated them, for they are not of the world any more than I am of the world. My prayer is not that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one. Well, of course, Jesus, he came on a rescue mission from outside of this world, right? That he calls the devil the ruler of this world, where sin and darkness and chaos reigns, and where we are ruled by our flesh. We talked about that over the last couple weeks. And Jesus comes to save us so that we will no longer be of the world. And because of who the ruler of the world is, the world hated Jesus, and he says it will hate his disciples too. That he eventually will be crucified by the world, and his disciples would eventually be killed as well. And they were so different from the conforming culture around them that they would eventually be killed, but Jesus prays for their faith to withstand the devil's attacks on them. And keep reading with me verses 16 through 19. They are not of the world, even as I am not of it. Sanctify them by the truth. Your word is truth. As you sent me into the world, I have sent them into the world. For them I sanctify myself, that they too may be truly sanctified. Well, in these couple verses, Jesus is teaching us to live as people who are distinct. So we are called to be unique. That we're called to be different. Actually, in fact, the Greek word for church, which is ekklesia, it means called out ones. Called out ones. That those reconciled to Jesus by faith are called out of the world into a union with him. That we leave our former identity behind, and our nature and our citizenship and affiliations behind, to follow the ways of Jesus. And the words in verse 19 of sanctified and sanctified reiterate this. That we are to be distinctly set apart from the world that we find ourselves in. Of course, if you grew up in the church, you may have heard the phrase, in the world, but not of the world. And the phrase comes from these verses. That we are to be separate from how our world and culture thinks and operates. And just to make what Jesus is saying here as simple as possible, that we should be able to walk to any culture and into any culture and fairly easily recognize, okay, this right here, that's the dominant culture that's right around me. That's how they operate, that's what they worship, that's how they think about relationships and sex, that's how they handle the money, that's how they parent, that's how they fill in the blank. And over there are the Christians. They're the called out ones. And you go, they're different. They spend their time and money in uniquely different ways. They focus their attention on distinctly different things in the culture around them. They obviously believe something different from the rest of these people right around them. The difference found in these called out ones should be so extensive and obvious. That, of course, gathering with people on Sunday mornings like we're doing right now is important, and it's very important. It's different than what the world does around us. But it should go much further than that, too. Monday through Saturday, and through the course of our entire lives as well. Well, Jesus goes on in verse 17, of course, praying for his disciples, but as we read this, you'll see that he's also praying for us, too. So this is verses 20 through 23. My prayer is not for them alone. I pray also for those who will believe in me through their message, that all of them may be one, Father, just as you are in me and I am in you. May they also be in us, so the world may believe that you have sent me. I have given them the glory that you gave me, that they may be one as we are one, and I in them and you in me, so they may be brought to complete unity. And the world will know that you sent me and have loved them even as you have loved me. So there's something about our called outness, our distinctiveness, our unity in a singular purpose that is so beautiful and so compelling and good that the rest of the world should see that way, that these people, that we are living their lives and be drawn to that. That's what's saying here in these couple of verses. That they want to be part of this unique group. That they want to be part of these followers of Jesus who won't be conformed to the patterns of the world. That they are transformed, and these folks, they would do anything to be part of what we have. But this breaks down when the church gets overtaken by the world. When we look just like the world that's around us, that effect is lost. Now, we are no longer a compelling people. Well, recently I stumbled upon an article about the downfall of a somewhat famous celebrity pastor who had a big moral failure and was recently removed by their church. It was this article was titled "The Sad Irony of Celebrity Pastors," and it was written by a journalist named Ben Sixsmith. And Ben, again, he's honest in the article. He says he's not a Christian, and what he has to say in this article really perked up my ears. He goes on, not just to talk about celebrityism within the church, but on a larger trend of what he sees in the American church as a whole. Actually, he calls it the "with a twist" of Christianity trend that he sees throughout the church, that it looks exactly like the culture today, but with just a little twist of Christianity to it. And so there was a humongous quote I had originally for this, but I just cut it down to just this last part of it that we want to read for you this morning. And it says, "I am not religious, so it's not my place to dictate to Christians what they should or should not believe. Still, if someone has a faith worth following, I feel that their beliefs should make me uncomfortable for not doing so. If they share 90% of my lifestyle and values, then there is nothing especially inspiring about them. Instead of making me want to become more like them, it looks very much as if they want to become more like me." And that's a challenging quote, isn't it? From the outside looking in, saying, you guys just look exactly like me. What's different about you? So how do we get here? How do we make it to this point? Well, one of the things that stood out about American Christianity, say about 30 years ago, was that, again, there was this perspective, this is just from what I've read, obviously, I'm only 36 years old, is that there are a lot of things was focused back then was about what we didn't do. That standing out from the world as a Christian was essentially, don't drink, don't smoke, don't dance, and don't date girls who do. Those are things that we were known for, things that we don't do. And 30 years ago, God was painted more in a stodgy light, as if he wasn't a big fan of fun in general. And there are a couple problems with this. One, that's an overly simplistic picture. It just falls woefully, painfully short of the beautiful ways that Christians are to stand out in Scripture. That we should be bursting in spiritual energy and the fruit of the Spirit, which we talked about in that passage last week. That we should be about love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and faithfulness and gentleness and self-control. That we should be at our core the most joyful people on the planet. But if you focus on just these things that we're against, that's not what we're about like. And two, thoughtful Christians begin to be like, wait, the Scriptures are filled with people maybe enjoying wine and dancing. In fact, Jesus, he served wine on multiple occasions, and the Psalms celebrate dancing with joy to our God. And so people were thinking, did we create a church culture that would exclude Jesus from being a part of it? But along with all those things, I would argue that came another trend to combat this perspective of Christianity being about what we don't do, and because they just were tired of being uncool in the world's eyes. So they just went and they swayed just a bit too closely with the world around us. It's like a bit of the church wanting to be invited to the cool kids table in high school. And I think the unfortunate outcome of this is that non-Christian journalists that we just read would look at some of those Christians that went this direction and conclude that instead of making me want to become more like them, it looks very much as if they want to become more like me. And with all this in mind, I think we need to have some careful categories to trace what this looks like to be in the world and not of the world. That if this is what Jesus really wants for us, if he says this is how the world will know that I am real, that I am risen from the grave, is from your unique called outness, then we need to have some careful discernment on how to balance this tension of how to be in the world and not of it. So here's what I want to do for the rest of my message time this morning. I want to give us two questions for us to talk about. And the first question is, what is normal in the world that should not be normal for me? And what is normal in the world that should not be normal for me? You know, being the church in our culture means that there will be things about our culture that seem utterly normal, but in no way it should be normal for us. That there is no way, of course, there's no way to give an exhaustive list of that here this morning. We'll be here forever. But my goal is simply to make you think and start asking the question is, should this thing be normal for me? And so just to give a little bit of an illustration, is I want to start talking about the Amish here this morning. Of course, the Amish are not an ideal model for us to follow. And they have the not of the world part down pat, but not so much in the world part. But there's something about their practice that I think is challenging for us this morning. You know, I didn't know this, but did you know that the new technologies are actually not forbidden for them? It's just that when a new invention comes out, they will deeply and thoughtfully consider how that will impact their community. So that when something new comes along, they actually literally use us, the surrounding Americans around them as guinea pigs. Now, they see what it does to us first, and then they will have a community meeting to discuss if they would like to adopt it. So they ask things like, is this as good for me, as good for us as an individual? Is this good for us as a community as a whole? Will this thing, if we adopt it, grow my love for Jesus and my love for my neighbors or not? And so, for example, of course, we know that they decided no for cars, which in our minds, I'm sure for many of us, that just seems different and hard to process. But, a journalist one time asked an Amish man, why they made this decision. And he answered by saying, have you seen what they did to your society? And the journalist was like, what are you talking about? And the Amish man responded by saying, well, do you know your neighbors? Do you know the names of your neighbors? And the journalist had to admit, no, he didn't. Then he asked the question, do you see how far away we live from our friends? And how many of us can walk to our friend's house? Again, all this relational distance that we have because we don't even know the people around us, but we had to go and have friends so far away is that we have in our lives is actually in some way the product of having cars in our life. Again, I have no desire or intention to get rid of my car, but there's something that we can learn from this. There's a community with distinctly different values that meaningfully affect their way of life. And the community is aware that what's normal out there will not necessarily be normal in here. I'm afraid that we don't do that. We don't have that perspective most of the time. The thing about the world, like I mentioned before, is that it's powerfully persuasive. That you don't know that the current is moving you. And many times we just caught up in the flow, whatever flow we find ourselves in, and we just don't stop and ask the question of, wait, should this be normal for me? Consider the entertainment choices that are incredibly normal in our culture. If we truly have different values about what content is healthy for us, then we probably should Netflix differently than the world around us. That we should watch TV differently from the world around us. Of course, what if instead of uncritically accepting any form of entertainment, we stop to ask the question, what is this doing to me? Is this praiseworthy? What if I watch this is normalizing in me? What will this do to us too, even if this becomes something that's normal for the church to watch and participate in? Think even about technology usage too. It's normal to always be swiping, clicking, viewing, typing. It's so bad that for many folks that our devices can start to feel like an appendage, like that we're not whole without them. And this causes us all too often to be distracted and frazzled, even zombie-like at times. But as people of Jesus, we value peace and presence and engagement. To have the ability to be a non-anxious presence empowered by the Spirit of God who gives us that supernatural peace and love and joy in us. But what we see with digital addiction and social media we see what digital addiction and social media does to us and those around us. We see the links between tech and mental health problems and overall life dissatisfaction. So we should be cautious with those things. What's normal out there better not be normal in here if we are to be distinct. Through Jesus, we have an opportunity to be called out of all of that, to be unhurried, to be present, to have an uncommon depth and maturity to us. And what if that, in particular, our technology usage becomes an area for someone like the writer of that article to, if he was around us, to say, there's something different about you. You are more present, more engaged, less anxious than the world around you. Again, here's some other categories to think about too. It's normal in our world to run yourself into the ground with busyness. Again, you won't get any flack for that. But should that be normal for us? It's normal to build your own spiritual buffet of beliefs, to pick and choose the things you like about Jesus, to ignore the things you don't, and even pull out things from other worldviews that you like and put in your belief system. Should that be normal for us? It's normal to allow your kids' extracurricular activities to take up so much of your schedule and you just become a shuttle service from one kid event to the next, and because of that, you ignore your spiritual health, and you ignore your marital health, and you ignore being in community with your fellow called out ones. Again, it's so normal out there. The question is, should it be normal for us? It's normal to gossip out there. Should that be normal for us too? It's normal to get into your political groups and just talk about how crazy, maybe even how evil everyone else is that's not in your group. Should that be normal for us too? Again, we should be constantly looking at things and patterns around us, aware of our temptation to be pulled into them, and ask the Spirit, should that be normal for me? Yeah, I'm not telling you what you should and should not do, but we need to start asking these questions. So that's the first question. The second question in light of all this is that what isn't normal in the world that should be normal for me? What isn't normal in the world that should be normal for me? Here's the thing, Jesus, he was not normal, was he? In any way, he was abnormal. He was different. His life was full of constant prayer and communion to his Father. He regularly withdrew from people to spend time with God. Fasting was a regular practice for him. His life was oriented around these practices, his communion with God. And people flocked to him with wonder and amazement. People constantly remarked that his teaching had authority that they had never heard before. There's no question that he stood out from the crowd. And he explains this in John chapter 8, verse 23. He says, but he continued, you are from below, I am from above. You are of this world, I am not of this world. Jesus declares, I am not from here. Everything that you value and that you care about that's coming from the world. But I am not of this world. He came to really show us what love looks like and what it really means to be human. In other words, he came to create a new normal for us, to show what the perfect human in communion with God was supposed to look like. By saving us, he means to create us into that same kind of abnormality that he had in his life. And the way that we are to follow in his footsteps is to make his patterns ours. Of course, the world normalizes sinful and unhealthy patterns, but we should be trying to normalize godly things. We should be trying to normalize godly things. If we do not normalize the things that Jesus did, then we should not expect have the same outcome that he did in his life. So it's so worth it for us to stop and check in and see if we are actually following Jesus in his abnormality. Like, how different is the way that you spend your time from your non-Christian neighbor, compared to your non-Christian neighbor? If they observe you for a week, would they walk away thinking your life is meaningfully different than theirs? Would they see you in the scriptures, praying for your friends and neighbors, checking in on your Sunday school class, arranging times to build relationships with those far from Jesus? What if that same person observed your family dinners and your conversations? Would they notice any difference from what you talked about with your family than your non-Christian neighbors? What about the way that you even use your home for hospitality? You know, how would this hypothetical person judge the way that you forgive people? Do you forgive in a different way compared to those who don't follow Jesus? Would you even be caught intentionally fasting for anything for spiritual purposes in order to grow? The question is, are you abnormal in the way that Jesus was abnormal? Are you normalizing things of God that allow you to become a new kind of normal like him? So if you're anything like me, you might be hearing all this and you might be thinking, all right, I have a lot of stuff to think about and pray about. I'm aware this sermon may feel like a lot. And for what it's worth, this was really a convicting sermon to teach and prepare for. I could go through the list of all the ways in which I would say to myself, no, I'm not really that much different from the world, honestly. But I do want to end up sharing this in order to give you some hope this morning. To be this compelling counterculture of called out ones, according to John chapter 17, we have to do all this together as one. That you will not fight the world successfully on your own. That's not the way that it works. But the way that you fight the world is through being completely connected with a counterculture that normalizes righteousness, that normalizes the things of God. And that should be us here at Prince Street Church. A different culture that normalizes the things of God, that normalizes righteousness. And it's not that we are to be loosely connected to this group of people, but immersed in this group that normalizes the things of God. And if we don't do that, we get swept away by the currents that we can't even see. The power of the world is that everyone seems to be doing the same things. So it all becomes normal to me. I don't even notice some of it. And what I do notice no longer seems that bad because everyone is doing it. So it's important that I have a group of people that normalizes the things of God so that I can even begin to notice the patterns of the world, what they are, not just simply the way that life is. And we need each other in this. We cannot fight the world on our own. We need each other here at Prince Street Church. And we are called to become people who normalize the things of God, not the things of this world, and spur each other on in those patterns. We need each other in this. Here's a pastor in Portland, Oregon, which is, again, not the most Christian place in America, who talks about this. He says, in the early parts of their church, rather than his people transforming their lives and their communities, they end up being conformed by their culture, and eventually they stop walking with Jesus. That they were swallowed up by the world because they didn't have the solid footing of biblical teaching, the spiritual practices, or a godly community. They had not yet normalized the things of God to an extent where it really sustained them in their journey. And I've seen this also happen to people I grew up with, where friends of mine who I thought were fairly solid in the faith just get totally immersed in the world around them. Where years later, I'm scrolling through Facebook and my heart breaks and I say, no, not them too. The tides of the world are very powerful, and they're so effective because they're so hard to see. They train us and normalize things for us while we don't even see what's happening. The world is a powerful enemy that we are wise to pay attention to. But thankfully, is no match for Jesus. He alone perfectly withstood the raging currents of the world around him, never once succumbing to its effects. He saw with perfect clarity what we do not, which is how the ways of the world are under the power of the devil and normalized to appeal to our flesh. Earlier in his same conversation with his disciples from John chapter 17, Jesus would tell them something that they need to hear. John chapter 16, verse 33 says, I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. That in this world you will have trouble. But take heart, I have overcome the world. Some of us here this morning especially need to hear this. To take heart, for I have overcome the world. That when faced with an invisible and influential enemy, this is a beautiful word to end on. Again, don't be overwhelmed by the forces set against you, but rather take heart. Have confidence. Have courage. Because Jesus, he has overcome the world and its pull and power in your life. That through his perfect abnormal life, his sacrificial death, and his resurrection, he has saved us out of the world. That we are no longer captive to its forces and demands. That for those of us in Jesus, we have been rescued from the dominion of darkness and brought into his kingdom of light. And through his Spirit, Jesus, he gives us his power. It's not impossible to fight the world, or for that matter, the flesh and the devil. That we have his Spirit. That he died to defeat sin's power and the world's influence. That God, by his Spirit and grace, is making us into a new humanity. To be light on the hill, showing others about our abnormality, what it really means to be human. That people who are of his kingdom and not of the world. That people who choose unity over divisiveness. That people who choose love over apathy. That we are people who choose transformation, not conformity. That through God's people, through God's Spirit, according to God's word, we can fight and see radical resurrection victory in our lives. Again, he gives us his Spirit to help us see what is so hard to see. To lead us into all truth and to help us become beautifully abnormal, just like him. Would you join me in prayer? Loving Father, thank you that this enemy of ours is one that you've already overcome. Thank you that we can take heart. Thank you that we can have hope even when we can see how destructive worldliness is. That we know that you have overcome the world. That we know that you have united us with yourself. We know that you have given us victory over the world. Father, help us to be a people who love the idea of walking in righteousness and holiness in the ways of you. Help us be a people who love being distinct and set apart from this world because this world believes the lies of the enemy. Lord, help us to normalize the basic practices of being a Christian. Help the things that you have called us to become normal here at Prince Street Church through us. Father, help us to identify the ways that we have become worldly, both individually and even collectively as a church. Help us to wage war on those things with the power of your Spirit. Help us to love and pursue godliness over worldliness. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen.